I wanted to share with you an experience I had. My wife and I recently attended an event in Vancouver. It was put on by a group that had taken the provincial government to court over its handling of the COVID emergency over the last couple of years and all the draconian measures that were a outpouring of it. But the interesting part of this was that at that event, there was a couple of politicians. One was a former premier of the province and somebody who wrote or was the last signatory or living premier, first minister for the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, Brian Peckford. And there was another gentleman, I won't mention his name, but he's a former MP and a lawyer. And we got to talking about this, what had gone on during this whole crazy time. And I asked him and I said, it would have been really good if conservatives had been outspoken during that time, during the Freedom Convoy part. Now, he said to me, he said, well, they just couldn't be. At the time, the leader of the conservatives, Mr. O'Toole, just wasn't letting them do that. He said, trust me, behind closed doors, there was a lot of heated discussions and debates. And I said, well, that's all wonderful, but Canadians who disagreed with what was going on could have used that leadership out front. And he said, well, at that time, 80% of Canadians were vaccinated. So it really wasn't politically a smart thing to do because, it's about getting elected. I said, excuse me, pardon me? What about the 20% that were, if these numbers are correct, that weren't vaccinated? Who was representing them? Then I asked him and I said, what about out of that 80%, how many of them were coerced into getting vaccinated? That they didn't really want to do it, but they had little alternative after what had gone on. I said, who was representing them? Then he went on to say, well, really wasn't a federal thing, it's a provincial thing. I said, excuse me, at the end of the day, these are Canadians. It doesn't matter what jurisdiction they fall into. It doesn't matter whether it's you can't just slough it off and say, well, it's a municipal, it's a provincial, it's not my problem. These are your constituents. They're always your problem. And it was the feds that were imposing the national emergency. Of course, they were your effing problem. And that's what it came down to. How could you take an attitude and simply say, well, it's all politics? At the end of the day, if you want to be a leader, it's going to be to do things that are unpopular. You've got to go against the grain. I would have loved to have seen all the conservative MPs at that time standing beside the truckers at the convoy. That would have caused a shift. They could have easily taken a neutral stance and said, look, we're not saying that you should get vaccinated or not vaccinated, but we are saying that it's wrong to mandate it. It's wrong to force people to have to do it. That's a position they could have taken. That was a tenable position. However, they didn't want to do it because they were practicing politics. And I reminded him and I said, look, at the end of the day, if you choose politics over your principles, what's the difference? Why vote for you versus an NDP, a Liberal, or the Greens? What is the difference if you essentially all cower to the same thing? True leadership is people who represent. And he said, well, we all can't be like Maxime Bernier. I mean, he's never going to get elected. He's just wanting to bring issues at the forefront that people are talking about. Hey, that's great. People are talking about issues. We're having debates. We're engaged in conversations. That's something they could have done. Those MPs could have requested, look, at a minimum, before we pass this emergency legislation, should we not have a debate on whether at the time the vaccines work, the masks work, the distancing works, the mandates work, all of this stuff works? That is a position they could have taken. That would have won them favor with reasonably minded people. But more importantly, it would have shown those Canadians that weren't being represented by anyone that somebody actually gave a shit and they had a spine. They actually took a position that wasn't built on taking their finger out of their ass and seeing which way the wind was blowing and how they could get elected. And I said to him, I said, at a minimum, I said, those MPs could have done something totally different. They could have said, hey, we recognize that ordinary Canadians are suffering, that people have been forced out of jobs, fired, and they've lost their income. We are going to do a measure. We're going to show our solidarity behind these Canadians. And I said they could have effectively offered to give up part of their pay. They could have said, we're going to donate that to whatever group or whatever fund was raising money for people in need. He said, well, why would we expect them to do that? Because they're leaders, my friend. They are setting the tone. They work for the citizens. The citizens, they are, by the behest of the citizens, they are in that position. At the minimum, they should be doing is representing them. It wasn't going to cost them everything, but that is what leaders do. They do the unorthodox at times when everybody else is going the other direction. You look at somebody who's running in US politics right now, Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, there's a guy who is not speaking conventional. He's talking about everything that it would be anti-establishment, anti-woke, against the narrative. And he's getting traction. He's now number 3 in the RNC race. I'm not saying he's going to beat Trump, but he's almost getting very close to where DeSantis' numbers are. Why is he popular in spite of his message? Because he's a truth teller. He sticks to his principles. He doesn't care which audience he's among. He's consistent. Somebody who tells the truth doesn't have to remember the lie they told yesterday. And that is why politicians are not revered. Anyway, the other gentleman who was there was, like I said, Brian Peckford, a man of integrity, somebody who has always toed the line and is still at 80 plus years old fighting this madness that we're living through. And there's somebody who, didn't sell out, didn't do all of those things, and looks at doing what's right before something that will just get him a gain and a win. And on a side note, this gentleman that I was arguing with, so to speak, was a lawyer. And that's the other problem we have. We have a lot of lawyers that are MPs, a lot of these people that are professionals. And you got to remember, again, I know lawyers, I deal with lawyers. It's not a question that I have a disdain for lawyers. But at the end of the day, when you are dealing in a position where sometimes your client is less than forthcoming and you are still willing to represent them, and I get it, everybody deserves representation, the law and whatever else. These people are used to generally finding a deal, a compromise. Principles aren't always something they adhere to or want to ascribe to. Anyway, those are my takes on it. You're welcome to chime in with yours. I would love to hear them. Check out some of my other past videos as well. You can follow me on my Rumble and my Locals account. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so. You'll also find me on Twitter now at Camera612, and I will see you next time.